Perhaps no other image of the Old West is as memorable as the fighting Indian. Bareback in buckskin with black braids flying, many saw Indians with only one face, the enemy. But to the Army, the Indians were both friend and foe. Many warriors signed up to become U.S. scouts and soldiers, eager to settle old scores against other tribes. And armed with the secrets of the West, knowing how to find food and water as well as the enemy, these Indians became the Army's advantage in the final conquest of Indian land.
A scout is like a lone wolf that must be looking all the time. Red Wing of the Crow people.
They were heroes whose greatness was never known and whose deeds are unsung. The men of the present day cannot conceive because they have not had the experience to make them understand the risk and the labors involved in that old wild life. George Bird Grinnell, June 1925.
In the Plains Indian Sign Language, the signal for scout was wolf. And so these young warriors soon became known as the Wolves for the Blue Soldiers. They were the eyes and ears of the U.S. Army. They were the Indian Scouts. And for more than a quarter of a century during the great Indian Wars of the West, thousands of these brave and loyal tribesmen tracked, trailed, and fought for the American soldiers against one common enemy, other Indians.
They made this alliance not because they particularly liked the whites or respected the whites, but simply because they were fighting the same enemy. I believe it's an old dictum in both diplomacy and in military history that the enemy of my enemy is my friend.
For centuries, the Crow, Pawnee, Arikara, and Shoshone had been fighting their own bitter war on the plains against the Sioux and Cheyenne people. The Sioux was a huge tribe and were relentlessly moving into ancient Crow country for buffalo and grazing grounds for their vast herds of swift ponies. The Crow were greatly outnumbered.
The Sioux, Cheyennes, the Assiniboines, Piegans were moving into our Crow country, and we were besieged from every direction, and it was getting dangerous for the tribe, Crow Indian tribe, to survive. So young men must become warriors very quickly.
Ancient rivalries were now translated into modern warfare, so that when the United States government began to battle the Sioux for possession of the Northern Plains, they already had ready and willing allies on the plains, the Pawnee, the Shoshone, the Crow. They were anxious to settle old scores. They were anxious to assist the whites in battling a common enemy, the Sioux. And in fact, the name Sioux comes from the Crow and Pawnee word for enemy.
The face of the Sioux is red, but his heart is black. These are our lands, but the Sioux stole them from us. They hunt upon our mountains. They fish in our streams. They have stolen our horses. They have murdered our squaws, our children. But the heart of the paleface has ever been red to the Crow. The great white chief will lead us against no other tribe of red men. Our war is with the Sioux. Old Crow, chief of the Crow Nation.
In the beginning, the government simply didn't trust the scouts. To them, an Indian was an Indian, and the policy was shove them aside, concentrate them on reservations, and wait for their race to die out. But an embarrassed cavalry began to hire them because alone, the Army was being humiliated. Their war against the tribes was not going well.
And in fact, their Indian opponents treated them with complete contempt. In a conference in Kansas, Cheyenne chiefs told General Sheridan to let his soldiers grow their hair long so that the Indian warriors could at least take good scalps, because the soldiers weren't even worth killing right now.
I don't think West Point taught anything about tracking or trailing. These young boys would come out west totally ignorant of what the geography was, and here they're given these company commands.
They were inexperienced riders on horseback. Matter of fact, they were infantry to begin with, and they brought some old wild horses, mules, and tried to make cavalrymen, all of them, for the campaign. A lot of them would get bucked off, get hurt, and they were a mess.
The West was a vast new frontier to the Army and an alien land in which they had to find small groups of a fast-moving enemy that it seemed no white man could catch.
Finding them, not fighting them, is the difficult problem to solve. Colonel Wesley Merritt.
But for the Indian Scout Wolves, trailing was a science and not a matter of guesswork. It really did take an Indian to find an Indian, and what they could do for the Bluecoats, no one else could do.
They were finely attuned to their environment, be it the desert Southwest with all of those parched expanses of sand and rocky mountains, or be it the great rolling high plains of the northern states, or be it the forests and mountains of the Pacific Northwest. They knew the conditions imposed on military operations by the particular conditions of the environmental setting. They were able to advise the troops where to go, how to live, and above all, how their enemies might be thinking and what their enemies might be doing.
Most of the tribe, the young boys, learned scouting, as we term it, from their earliest years. How to track an enemy, how to find wild animals, how to read the things that are on the ground, the turned leaf or the grass that's been stepped on. They just learned that from the beginning, so they were natural scouts.
And they were also natural warriors like Medicine Crow, one of the Crow Nation's greatest leaders. By the time he joined the white men's cavalry, he had already become a chief at the age of only 22. Training began almost from birth.
Stepfather trained my grandfather, Medicine Crow, to become a warrior, training how to run, wrestle, learn how to track, and know something about changes in the weather, everything about a warrior's life. So at the age of 14, he went on his first warpath.
By 1866, these young Indian Scout volunteers were becoming an accepted fact of Army life. And it was during this year that Congress passed an act giving President Andrew Johnson a new power.
To enlist and employ in the territories and Indian country a force of Indians not to exceed 1,000 to act as scouts. Andrew Johnson, President of the United States.
It was official. Even Washington now saw that the Indian Scouts offered the Army its very best chance to win the West. The Scouts were saving them precious time, lives, and even money.
It cost a lot of money to get Buffalo Bill to lead a column across the plains, but Indian Scouts were delighted to work for $13 a month, the pay of a private soldier. And not only did they work cheap, they were incredibly knowledgeable and incredibly skilled. And so it was a bargain for the Army to hire them.
Already the Scouts were beginning to play a curious and crucial role in the Army's campaign on the Western Plains. Not only were they hastening the conquest of some of the most powerful leaders of their enemy, but they were also bringing an early end to their own freedom.
I was born upon the prairie, where the wind blew free and there was nothing to break the light on the sun. I was born where there were no enclosures and where everything drew a free breath. I want to die there and not within walls. 10 Bears of the Comanche people.
We now return to Indians and the Army.
I do not think that any braver men ever lived than the Pawnee Indians. They were true and loyal soldiers, brave as any body of men I ever saw, as good trailers as ever lived. Luther North.
Many Plains tribes called a scout a wolf, and the Indian Sign Language signal was the same for both. It was also the same for the brave Pawnee people, 2 fingers held up to indicate the ears of the animal. It was a term of respect, not contempt, and it was only fitting. Because it was the Pawnee who made up the first and largest company of Indian Scouts ever to work for the U.S. Army. They were the first wolves for the Blue Soldiers, and many say they were the best.
The Pawnee Scouts rated high in effectiveness simply because their leaders were effective, because the North Brothers knew how to lead them. The Pawnees were effective also because they were superb fighters and they were pitted against the bitterest of their enemies, the Sioux and the Cheyennes, with whom they had a long tradition of desperate warfare.
In their early youth, Frank and Luther North, the North Brothers, followed their surveyor father to Omaha, Nebraska, where they came to know the Pawnees on the plains. Frank, who spoke the Indians' language, was hired by traders as an interpreter on the reservations. And within a short time, Pawnees considered him not only a neighbor, but also a great friend.
The North Brothers, both of them, Frank and Luther, were among these people we're calling Indian thinkers. They both had had sufficiently close relations with the Pawnee Indians to be accepted and trusted by them and to function in positions of leadership with them simply because they were respected and the Pawnees would follow them.
The North Brothers both became Indian fighters for the U.S. Army, but it was Frank who was the first to become commissioned a captain and given the power to enlist the Pawnees. He was also given a new name, Skiditaka, or White Wolf.
They respected his bravery. They respected his ability to make decisions. They respected him because of the low casualty rate amongst the Pawnee Scouts.
The Pawnees were phenomenal trailers, whom I have known to follow the trail of a band of Sioux for hours after night, overtake them, and return to camp with scalps as evidence of their success. No hostile Indian ever approached near enough to even see our camp and succeeded in getting away with his scalp. Frank North.
In the world of the Pawnee, a tribe outnumbered by their Sioux and Cheyenne enemy 25-1, it was no surprise the North Brothers never had a shortage of Pawnee scouts signing up. But later, in the Indian Wars, there were even more reasons than just revenge to join the Army.
My great-grandfather, William Wrightington, apparently became a scout in 1870. By that time, becoming a scout also had obtained an economic incentive. The buffalo was being destroyed. The Pawnee economy was in shambles. There was often starvation on the Pawnee reservation. So the service in the military gave them money, and it gave them the opportunity to strike back at their enemies.
The military also gave scouts a way to remain free and to hold on to the old ways, a way for a Pawnee to remain Pawnee.
Well, reservation life to a free Indian must have been the same as a sow would be to a European-born person. It was the most boring life in the world for a young man who had hunted buffalo, traveled where he pleased. The only means of escape was to join the Army, and they did.
And once they did, the Pawnee earned praise quickly and proved that they were better suited for military life than perhaps any other tribe.
They had to live orderly lives. War parties had to be conducted in an orderly manner. Their village life had to be conducted in an orderly manner. The hunts had to be conducted in an orderly manner. And they transformed this discipline into a form of behavior that was compatible with military life. They could follow orders, they could fight as units.
But just because a Pawnee fought as a soldier didn't mean he necessarily looked like one. On the campaign trail, an Indian was an Indian, and the North Brothers, in their wisdom, didn't try to change that.
Even though the Indian Scouts were often given white soldier uniforms to wear, they would modify them so that even an organized band such as the North Brothers Pawnee Scouts had a wild hodgepodge of uniforms. Often they would cut the legs off, make leggings out of them, cut breechcloths and make the uniforms conform to Indian styles of clothing. And they would decorate them with traditional Indian accoutrements, so that whenever an army column would cross the plains, the Indian scouts formed a colorful brigade that moved ahead.
The North brothers knew that by allowing the Pawnee scouts to be themselves and not impose strict soldier discipline, they would do what they did best. So when it came to war, a Pawnee was always allowed to fight as an Indian.
Even though they rode with the whites into battle, when coming close to combat, the Indians would usually return to their own traditional modes of fighting. They would discard the clothing of the white man because they wanted to go into battle as an Indian. They didn't want to fight them as lackeys of the whites. And so they were anxious to put on their paint, to discard their white clothing, and to go into battle in a traditional way.
And by letting the Pawnees do their work in their own way, they often did it with their own weapons. Although there is some debate about how good these Indians were with a rifle, there was not a question about what a Pawnee could do with a bow.
The Plains Indian warrior could load the bow from his quiver and fire it to the point where some people have said that they've seen Indian warriors keep 6 arrows in the air at a time by loading and just simply firing simultaneously. That's a rate of fire a good deal better than the single-loading Springfield carbines that U.S. cavalrymen had.
Frank North had a warm and loyal relationship with his Pawnee scouts, proving for the first time to the government that Indians could be trusted. They called him grandfather. They were devoted, and he loved them as a grandfather might love his family.
On one occasion on the northern plains, when pursued by several hundred Sioux, he and a small band of his scouts, less than a dozen men, were on good ponies and thought they could get away. But indeed, the Sioux continued to gain on them. Suddenly, North's horse fell, and he himself was knocked unconscious. Instead of leaving him to his fate and saving themselves, his small party of Pawnees dismounted, pulled out their rifles, surrounded him, and fought the Sioux off, while one of their number rubbed snow in his face to wake him up. This was the kind of devotion, this was the kind of commitment that Frank North and other white officers who commanded Indian scouts came to understand they could expect from their Indian friends.
We now return to Indians and the Army.
1876 was not a good year for Indian fighters, even the greatest. General Crook suffered a humiliating defeat, and George Armstrong Custer didn't live to tell the story of his. But out of this time also came some of the most famous Indian scouts in all of history. Warriors with names like Bloody Knife, Young Hawk, and Curly, who were loyal, courageous, and sometimes caught up in a war cloud of controversy.
The scalp of no white man hangs in our lodges, but they are as thick as grass in the wigwams of the Sioux. Our war is with the Sioux, and only them. Where the white warrior goes, there shall we be also. Old Crow, chief of the Crow Nation.
As fate would have it, both of history's most famous Indian scouts hit the trail for George Armstrong Custer, the men the Arikara Indians called Son of the Morning Star. He was a flamboyant, colorful figure who considered himself an expert on Indians.
General Custer was a romantic. General Custer reveled in all of what he looked upon as the barbaric customs and way of life and ceremonies and other rites of the Indians. And so he encouraged this sort of thing simply so he could write about it for Eastern audiences who really lapped it up.
Many of the Arikara Indians, or Rees for short, admired Custer and were proud to serve him. But there was one who Custer favored above all the rest. His name was Bloody Knife.
He formed an attachment to General Custer that was hardly short of worshipful, and Custer in turn treated him like he would one of his worshipful hounds, you know, and Bloody Knife profited from it.
Bloody Knife was the son of a Hunkpapa Sioux and an Arikara mother, two different tribes that were bitterly at war with each other. His youth was passed in his father's village, where he paid a terrible price for his mixed blood.
he was persecuted by Gall and Sitting Bull and other pure hunk papas. The persecution got so great that Mama took Bloody Knife back home to the Rees.
It's said this legacy of hostility made Bloody Knife a sharper scout, a crack-shot and master of the bow. He often required 2 wagons to haul in the game he killed. But for all the good he could do, he could also be bad and get plenty wild and just plain mean.
He had a high temper from all accounts. He drank too much from all accounts. But he was an excellent scout, apparently. Custer put him #1.
Unfortunately, George Armstrong Custer's temper could also run high. And in one famous incident in the Black Hills of Dakota, he nearly killed Bloody Knife in a fit of anger. It was in 1874, and rumor had it that gold had been discovered in the forbidden Black Hills. Custer and the 7th Cavalry had been sent by General Philip Sheridan on a scouting mission of the area, an area swarming with Sioux. And somewhere on that trip, no exact date is known, Bloody Knife, while scouting a trail ahead, directed some Army wagons to a high bank, where they somehow got stuck and became delayed. And then, as the story goes, Custer, in a rage, galloped up, tore his pistol from its holster, and fired at the scout. Said Bloody Knife,
"It is not a good thing you have done to me. If I had been possessed of madness too, you would not see another day."
Custer replied,
"My brother, it was madness of the moment that made me do this, but it is gone now. Let us shake hands and be friends again."
Bloody Knife consented, and the incident was forgotten. For the next 2 years, Custer and Bloody Knife spent much time together, and it was to be their last. It was now 1876, and both Custer and his trusted scout were about to meet their fates, but not the way they'd figured.
Custer promised Bloody Knife that after a great victory at the Little Bighorn, when he went back to Washington, that he'd take Bloody Knife with him and make him a big man among the whites.
It was June 25th, 1876, the summer of the Army's big campaign against the Sioux. Washington was determined to force the last hostile holdouts onto the reservations. Custer and the 7th Cavalry had been closing in on a hot Indian trail and had moved along the bluffs of the Little Bighorn River in Montana. But his scouts were worried. They had found a gigantic enemy encampment below, so Bloody Knife warned his friend.
He warned Custer that there were more Indians than they could get through in 2 or 3 days, to which Custer laughed and said he thought they'd get through them in 1 day.
But Custer wouldn't listen, and he ordered the Rees to join with Major Marcus Reno, who had taken command of one of the regiment's battalions. Bloody Knife followed the orders and marched on to the Valley of his Death.
The Rees pretty much gave way and went off to do what Custer told them they could do, which was to round up Sioux ponies. But Bloody Knife stuck right with Major Reno. And in the fighting in the timber, after Reno had halted his charge and withdrawn into the timber, they were both sitting together on horseback when a bullet punched through the trees and smashed into Bloody Knife's head and spattered blood and brains all over Major Reno's face. Bloody Knife's punctured head and corpse remained down in the timber. And 2 women came and cut off his head amidst all of the plundering and butchery and mutilation that was going on there. And they carried it into the village on a pole, where their mother looked at the head and said, "That is my brother."
Bloody Knife became one of 3 Indian scouts who gave their lives at the Little Bighorn. But it was another of Custer's scouts who gained even more fame because he survived the battle. This scout's name was Curley, and he had reporters even talking about him after the day he died.
I think Curley was the victim of the media of the day. He, in the first place, he didn't know a word of English. He was a teenager with the Crow Scouts.
Curly was in fact only 17, the youngest of all the scouts that rode to the Little Bighorn. And like the rest, once he had helped guide Custer close to the enemy campground, he was told he was free to go.
You guys take off and do what you want to, and I'll fight the battle. You've done your part by getting me here. Well, Curly stuck with Custer up beyond the point where the last messenger came back, and beyond which we can only speculate what really happened.
Curly claimed he had seen the entire battle unfold and that he was the only survivor. But because he couldn't speak English, interpreters often altered his story, sometimes grossly, and he became known as a terrible liar.
Newsmen for the next 40 years would come out and look for Curly, and he was learning English gradually, but they would give him $5 for a good story, and he'd have to, if he couldn't invent a story, they invented it for him. Consequently, Curly got a bad reputation.
But after his death, Curly's name was finally cleared. Archaeological excavation at the battlefield proved what this young scout had said all along.
And it appears really that Curly told the truth all the way through. And we know pretty much how far Curly went with Custer, at what point he left Custer, that he got to a distant ridge, turned around and saw the last of the fighting and saw the men on Custer Hill get overrun by the last Sioux rush. Then made his way on to safety and became, I suppose, what he always said he was, the last only survivor of Custer's last stand. They were cruel. They were superb fighters. They were the toughest, most formidable fighters that the United States Army encountered anywhere in the West. They were the most finely adapted peoples to their environment of any Indians in the West. Their environment, the desert Southwest, with those burning deserts and those high rocky mountains, was the most hostile of the landscape that the U.S. Army campaigned in.
White men called the Apaches the scourge of the Southwest after the Civil War, and they were famous for their treachery. And between 1882 and 1886, they eluded, frustrated, and angered the Army more than any other Indian enemy in the annals of Army history. Government policy read that the last Apache must be returned to the reservation or die in the mountains. And that included the elusive and mythical man, Geronimo. But to find the Apache and then catch him soon became the impossible goal.
The best defense the Apaches had was their ability to endure more hardships and longer. So they would be on horses or mules and would go to the roughest possible terrain, geographical terrain, and stay on it and do without food or water longer than the Army could. They would ride their animals to death, and they would eat them when they died and continue going. And when they could come across the ranch, either in the United States or in Mexico, they would take more animals and keep on going. The Army could not do that.
So once again, the cavalry turned to Indian scouts. General George Crook, one of the best and wiliest of Indian fighters, believed that the only way to fight an Apache was with another Apache. And even though the Army's top brass didn't trust them, they also knew their own men were simply no match.
To surprise those people in their mountain recesses was impossible unless you had someone who knew the country and knew where they were likely to be. This is the reason Crook was right when he said the best ones for tracking those Apache refugees is someone who has just surrendered from them. He knows where they are. He knows the terms of the country up there. Only he can lead us to them, and it worked.
But General Crook's scouts weren't only looking for the bust-out Apaches who had fled their reservations. They were also hired to fight them, to kill them if need be. And that meant sometimes hunting down your own father or brother.
The majority of the Apaches wanted peace by this time. They realized they could no longer win. After 50, 60 years of fighting Spanish, Mexican, and later the Americans, they knew that they could no longer win. And so they decided that peace was more important.
But never was the motivation of an American Indian to sign up with the white man less clear-cut than with the Apache. Even Geronimo's son was a scout for a time. It seemed each scout had his own reason for enlisting, and sometimes more than one. Black Rope, which means rope made of black horsehair, was the Apache name of this scout. His English name was John. His father was an influential leader and medicine man, and he was only a very young warrior when he signed on to become a scout.
He talked about the advantage of being a scout, that you could draw at the commissary $2 worth of whatever your relatives wanted. And $2 in those days was a lot of money. And he had a horse, and he was looked up to by fellow Apache people on the reservation. So it did hold some sort of place for him within the people themselves.
John Rope ended up having to hunt down his very own blood relatives. Relatives who had married into a hostile band. And when Rope's unit was sent to find them, he had no choice but to go. And though it may be hard to understand how they could fight against their own families, many Apaches liken it to the white man's own Civil War. But even once the Apache Wars were finished late in 1886, the conflict and turmoil among its people remained. And the reasons why can be seen in the fate of 3 Apache men, Chato, Martin, and Keita. All 3 were scouts for the U.S. Army, and all 3 did their parts to hasten Geronimo's surrender.
There is no more disgraceful page in the history of our relations with the American Indians than that which conceals the treachery visited upon Chato and the Chiricahua scouts who remained loyal to the U.S. government. Captain John G. Bork.
His adult name was Chato, the Flat Nose, and many considered him a brilliant leader of the hostile Chiricahua Apaches. He was with Geronimo in 1882 in the Sierra Madre Mountains of Sonora, Mexico, when General Crook attacked their stronghold. And when Chato finally gave up, he decided to become a scout.
Chato then argued with Geronimo and others that it was time that we must give up and make the best of our new life. And even Geronimo and all of them surrendered and came up for the first time to live on the White Mountain Reservation. Chato firmly believed that now he must change and was willing to be a scout.
Chato was one of the Chiricahua Apache scouts that worked very hard with the Army when they tried to find Geronimo in Mexico and have Geronimo surrender yet again. Chato was a scout that earned the respect of nearly all the Army officers that worked with him. They greatly respected his ability as a scout, his intelligence, his bravery. They just greatly respected him as a person.
In fact, Chato was so respected, he was invited to Washington with a select group of Apache scouts for a meeting with President Grover Cleveland early in 1886. He was presented with a large silver medal engraved with the word peace. But that gift soon turned black on Chato's fateful train ride home.
They're actually on the train back to Arizona when the train is stopped at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. The train is stopped because the government has decided to arrest the entire Chiricahua Apache tribe and send them basically to prison camps in Florida. And Chato and his men are, of course, then sent from Fort Leavenworth, not back to their homes in Arizona, but to prisoner of war camps in Florida. I believe that when Chato arrived in Florida, he still had the medal that had been given to him by the government.
I thought something good would come to me when they gave it to me. Why was I given this to wear in the guardhouse? Chato, 1886.
A similar and sad fate belongs to Keita and Martin, 2 Apache scouts related by blood to Geronimo. Although unrewarded or even thanked by the U.S. Army, by some accounts, they are credited with ending the Apache Wars once and for all.
The fate of Keita and Martin can be taken as a parable, not only for the treatment of all the Chiricahua Apache scouts who so loyally served the United States Army, but also a parable for the treatment of the entire Chiricahua Apache tribe. Martin and Keita were 2 Chiricahua Apache scouts who took Lieutenant Charles Gatewood to the camp of Geronimo in Mexico. And they were the ones, along with Lieutenant Gatewood, that convinced Geronimo for the last time to once and for all surrender.
We know that they were very courageous and daring men to place themselves next to an officer of the United States Army and boldly march right into Geronimo's rancheria. They must have been pretty smart, pretty astute diplomats to manage to calm Geronimo down and get him to talking instead of immediately starting to shoot.
Geronimo looked down at the two scouts coming up and said to his people, Yanosha and others, kill him. And Yanosha and the others said, no, and if you try, we will kill you, Geronimo. Let's hear what they have to say. These are our cousins. And so Martin and Keatau, who were scared, went back up and relayed the message that Gatewood had come with from General Miles.
And what was the reward that Keita and Martin received for risking their lives to force Geronimo's surrender? It was the same fate as the enemy Chiricahuas, who hated the white man and had fought so hard against him.
The reward of Keita and Martin for their service was to be handcuffed and thrown on a train that was taking Geronimo and the other Chiricahua Apaches of his band to prisoner of war camps in Florida.
Whether you had sided with the whites, as the Apache scouts had done, or whether you had fought them, as Geronimo had done, you met the same fate. In this case, sent to imprisonment in Florida and eventually Oklahoma. It didn't matter what position you had taken, because the government was blinded in its obligations to Indian people by its inherent racism. An Indian was an Indian was an Indian, and they had to go.
What is life? It is the flash of a firefly in the night. It is the breath of a buffalo in the wintertime. It is the little shadow which runs across the grass and loses itself in the sunset. And when legends die, there are no more dreams. When there are no more dreams, there is no more greatness. Crowfoot, Blackfoot Indian.
The Indian scouts had made a difficult choice. Many among their own race had viewed them as traitors, as did many whites. But they had made their choice. They had risked their lives for the white man's cause so that their people might survive. And for that, they became history's unsung heroes.
The scouts, by and large, in history books are simply a word here, an expression there, a paragraph now and then, and there's nothing definitive ever said about these remarkable men who did so much for their own people and for the government of the United States.
In the end, the Army got the credit for winning the wars. But what about the Indians? For loyal service to the government, the Pawnee Scouts were driven out of their homelands of Nebraska and moved to Oklahoma, where a high death rate took many of their lives. The Apache Scouts became prisoners of war for 28 years, and of all the tribes, earned the least respect from the white world for what they had fought so hard to gain.
If it hadn't have been for the Apache Scouts, I doubt that the Geronimo Indian Wars would have ended the way in which they did. I think they would have ended simply with Geronimo living south of the border, and today he probably would be a forgotten Indian.
A forgotten Indian? Just like the scouts from the Army, the brave wolves for the Bluecoats disappeared from the pages of history without thought and without reward.
I think all the scouts were brave. I think they all were bold. I think they were all individuals. They didn't get any credit or didn't demand any credit because it never occurred to an Apache that they should receive it. It wasn't a matter of gratitude or ingratitude. The Apaches just simply did not think in terms of getting credit like the white man does.
Their reward for loyal service to the White Army was that at the end of the Indian Wars, ironically, they went to the reservation with those they had fought. And so whether you had battled the whites constantly for possession of the plains, or whether you had worked with the whites in a spirit of accommodation to end warfare on the plains, you still wound up in exactly the same place, imprisoned on the reservation. Because to white America, it didn't matter if you had been a hostile or a scout. You were still just an Indian.
This is how the West was really won. Indian scouts and soldiers helping put tribes on reservations faster than the Army could ever dream of. General Crook said, to polish a diamond, there's nothing like its own dust. Without Indian allies, their conquest would have dragged on with many more hardships and much more pain. If the truth be known, Indian scouts probably saved more lives than they ended. But what they could never save was their own way of life that soon came to a close as the trails to the West remained open.
It's where it all started.
Our bodies are actually made out of recycled material from stars.
And where it will all end.
The Milky Way is on a collision course.
Galaxies colliding with the Milky Way are coming right at us.
The universe, all new episodes.
The young boys learned scouting, as we term it, from their earliest years. How to track an enemy, how to find wild animals, how to read the things that are on the ground, the turned leaf or the grass that's been stepped on. They just learned that from the beginning, so they were natural scouts.
And they were also natural warriors like Medicine Crow, one of the Crow Nation's greatest leaders. By the time he joined the white men's cavalry, he had already become a chief at the age of only 22. Training began almost from birth.
Stepfather trained my grandfather, Medicine Crow, to become a warrior, training how to run, wrestle, learn how to track, and know something about changes in the weather, everything about a warrior's life. So at the age of 14, he went on his first warpath.
By 1866, these young Indian Scout volunteers were becoming an accepted fact of Army life. And it was during this year that Congress passed an act giving President Andrew Johnson a new power.
To enlist and employ in the territories and Indian country a force of Indians not to exceed 1,000 to act as scouts. Andrew Johnson, President of the United States.
It's in battling a common enemy, the Sioux. And in fact, the name Sioux comes from the Crow and Pawnee word for enemy.
The face of the Sioux is red, but his heart is black. These are our lands, but the Sioux stole them from us. They hunt upon our mountains. They fish in our streams. They have stolen our horses. They have murdered our squaws, our children. But the heart of the paleface has ever been red to the Crow. The great white chief will lead us against no other tribe of red men. Our war is with the Sioux. Old Crow, chief of the Crow Nation.
In the beginning, the government simply didn't trust the scouts. To them, an Indian was an Indian, and the policy was shove them aside, concentrate them on reservations, and wait for their race to die out. But an embarrassed cavalry began to hire them because alone, the Army was being humiliated. Their war against the tribes was not going well.
And in fact, their Indian opponents treated them with complete contempt. In a conference in Kansas, Cheyenne chiefs told General Sheridan to let his soldiers grow their hair long so that the Indian warriors could at least take good scalps, because the soldiers weren't even worth killing right now.
I don't think West Point taught anything about tracking or trailing. These young boys would come out west totally ignorant of what the geography was.
Indian scouts. And for more than a quarter of a century during the great Indian Wars of the West, thousands of these brave and loyal tribesmen tracked, trailed, and fought for the American soldiers against one common enemy, other Indians.
They made this alliance not because of the particularly like the whites or respected the whites, but simply because they were fighting the same enemy. I believe it's an old dictum in both diplomacy and in military history that the enemy of my enemy is my friend.
For centuries, the Crow, Pawnee, Arikara, and Shoshone had been fighting their own bitter war on the plains against the Sioux and Cheyenne people. The Sioux was a huge tribe and were relentlessly moving into ancient Crow country for buffalo and grazing grounds for their vast herds of swift ponies. The Crow were greatly outnumbered.
The Sioux, Cheyennes, the Assiniboines, Piegans were moving into our Crow country, and we were besieged from every direction, and it was getting dangerous for the tribe, Crow Indian tribe, to survive. So young men must become warriors very quickly.
Ancient rivalries were now translated into modern warfare, so that when the United States government began to battle the Sioux for possession of the Northern Plains, they already had ready and willing allies on the plains: the Pawnee, the Shoshone, the Crow. They were anxious to settle old scores. They were anxious to assist the white.
And here they're given these company commands.
They were inexperienced riders on horseback. Matter of fact, they were infantry to begin with, and they brought some old wild horses, mules, and try to make cavalrymen out of them for the campaign. A lot of them would get bucked off, get hurt, and they were a mess.
The West was a vast new frontier to the Army and an alien land in which they had to find small groups of a fast-moving enemy that it seemed no white man could catch.
Finding them, not fighting them, is the difficult problem to solve. Colonel Wesley Merritt.
But for the Indian Scout Wolves, trailing was a science and not a matter of guesswork. It really did take an Indian to find an Indian, and what they could do for the Bluecoats, no one else could do.
They were finely attuned to their environment, be it the desert Southwest with all of those parched expanses of sand and rocky mountains, or be it the great rolling high plains of the northern states, or be it the forests and mountains of the Pacific Northwest. They knew the conditions imposed on military operations by the particular conditions of the environmental setting. They were able to advise the troops where to go, how to live, and above all, how their enemies might be thinking and what their enemies might be doing.
Most of the tribes
Perhaps no other image of the Old West is as memorable as the fighting Indian. Bareback in buckskin with black braids flying, many saw Indians with only one face, the enemy. But to the Army, the Indians were both friend and foe. Many warriors signed up to become U.S. scouts and soldiers, eager to settle old scores against other tribes. And armed with the secrets of the West, knowing how to find food and water as well as the enemy, these Indians became the Army's advantage in the final conquest of Indian land.
A scout is like a lone wolf that must be looking all the time. Red Wing of the Crow people.
They were heroes whose greatness was never known and whose deeds are unsung. The men of the present day cannot conceive because they have not had the experience to make them understand the risks and the labors involved in that old wild life. George Bird Grinnell, June 1925.
In the Plains Indian Sign Language, the signal for scout was wolf, and so these young warriors soon became known as the Wolves for the Blue Soldiers. They were the eyes and ears of the U.S. Army. They were the